Nobody at the agency told Mwende Wambua that the child was dying. They definitely didn't tell her the child hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years, or that the silence had a medical name, or that 3 continents of specialists had already quietly stopped expecting it to break. Nobody mentioned that the father was the kind of man whose name made grown port officials find something urgent to do in another room, or that the walls around his house were that high for a reason that had nothing to do with privacy. What they told Mwende was that the pay was better than anything else in the ledger and that nobody seemed to last there very long. She should have asked why. She took the job instead. And on her 7th morning inside that beautiful frozen house on the hill, a 5-year-old girl the doctors had quietly given up on lifted one trembling hand off a hospital blanket, reached for a stranger from a country 6,000 miles away, and said the single word that would end up bringing an empire to its knees.
Welcome to K-Drama Fruit Tales. Stay till the end for that part, and tell me after, in the comments, whether Mwende was the bravest woman ever to walk through the gates, or the most reckless. Let's begin.
Mwende Wambua arrived in South Korea with 11,000 shillings folded into the lining of her passport wallet. One suitcase that still smelled faintly of her grandmother's kitchen no matter how many times she aired it out, and a family plot of land back in Machakos that the bank had begun sending increasingly polite, increasingly final letters about. The placement agency in Nairobi had over 40 listings the week she walked in, cleaning positions and caregiving posts, and one hotel contract in Doha that 3 separate women had already turned down for reasons nobody would say out loud. The agency woman had slid a single sheet across the desk without much ceremony. Private household. Live out. 1 child. The pay was nearly double anything else on the board. Why is it still open? Mwende had asked. Because 4 years running a Nairobi creche teaches you to notice when a good deal is too good. Does it matter? The woman said, not unkindly, and slid a pen across after the page. It should have mattered. Mwende signed anyway because 11,000 shillings and a bank letter have a way of making a person stop asking the second question once they've heard an answer to the first. The taxi from Mokpo station climbed up out of the smell of the harbor. Diesel and salt and drying squid, into the hills above Udelson, where the streets narrowed, the walls grew taller, and the noise of the port fell away behind her like something the wind had simply decided to keep. It stopped, finally, at a gate the color of wet slate, tall enough that Mwende had to tip her head back to find where it ended against the sky. She checked her watch. 10 minutes early. Her grandmother's voice, unbidden, the way it always arrived exactly when needed. Early is on time, my girl, and on time is already late. The gate swung open before she'd so much as raised a hand to the intercom. A woman filled the gap in it. Somewhere in her 60s, hair scraped back into a bun so tight it looked like it hurt, and eyes that had clearly watched a long parade of hopeful young women walk through this exact opening and fail to last the month. You're the Kenyan, the woman said. It wasn't a question, and there was no warmth in it to soften the fact. I already know everything about you that I need to know. She turned and started walking without waiting to see whether Mwende would follow. Don't touch the walls. Don't touch anything that looks more expensive than your plane ticket, because everything in this house is more expensive than your plane ticket. Shoes off at the second door, not the first. The first is stone, it doesn't count as inside. I am Madame Yang. 32 years in this household. You will call me Madame Yang. Not Auntie. Not ma'am. I have never once in my life been anyone's ma'am. Understood, Madame Yang. Madame Yang looked her over then. One unhurried sweep, head to shoes, the way you'd size up livestock at a market you'd already decided not to buy from. Younger than the last one. Is that a problem? Everything about you is a problem I haven't finished weighing yet. But she kept moving, and Mwende followed her into a house that swallowed sound the way deep water swallows light. Pale stone floors. Dark, expensive wood. A grand piano in the front room with a skin of dust across its closed lid. Untouched long enough that the dust had stopped looking recent. And white lilies, funeral lilies, the kind Mwende's own grandmother would sooner have burned the house down than allowed inside it while nobody was actively being mourned. Standing in tall vases in nearly every room they passed. No toys anywhere. No small shoes by the door. No drawings taped to any surface. It didn't feel like a house where a child lived. It felt like a house where a child was being carefully, expensively kept. Where is she? Mwende asked. The little girl. Something in Madame Yang's shoulders pulled tight. Miss Sua is resting. She rests a great deal these days. A pause, and something crossed the older woman's face that on a gentler person might have simply been called grief. You'll see the master first. He decides everything under this roof. I only open the gate for the ones he agrees to see. What's he like? Madame Yang stopped in front of a heavy black door and studied Mwende for a long moment, the way you'd study someone you were deciding whether to warn or simply let learn the hard way. Are you afraid of anything, Miss Wambua? Debt collectors. Puff adders. My grandmother, on the rare occasions I've disappointed her. You'll learn a fourth thing today. She knocked twice, precise as a metronome. Try not to cry in front of him. The girl before you cried before she'd even sat down in the chair. The room beyond the door was dim and expensively quiet, one entire wall given over to glass, and past the glass the whole gray sweep of the harbor and the sea beyond it, laid out below like something a man had purchased outright rather than simply happened to live above. The man behind the desk didn't look up when the door opened. Moon Jivan. She didn't know the name yet. Didn't know that in certain rooms of the city, people lowered their voices before saying it, the way you lower your voice near a fire that could still, given the chance, catch something. He was younger than she'd braced herself for. Dangerous in the way of a blade kept too clean to be merely decorative. Sit, he said, in English, with the flat certainty of a man who had never once needed to ask a thing twice. She sat. He looked up and Mwende, who did not frighten easily, who had once talked a Nairobi landlord out of an illegal lockout using nothing but a raised voice and a photocopied lease, felt something in her chest drop half an inch because his eyes weren't cold at all. That was the part nobody at the agency had thought to mention. Everyone had said monster, 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 and here in front of her were the eyes of a man who hadn't slept properly in 2 years and had long since stopped expecting to. Mwende Wambua. He read from a single printed sheet without inflection. 29. Machakos. Diploma in Early Childhood Education. 4 years in a Nairobi creche, 2 more in private homes. He set the page down flat. Overqualified to babysit. Underqualified for what this house actually requires of a person. Why Korea? Then, if you don't mind me asking the same back. He glanced up properly for the first time. Excuse me? You asked why I came all this way for a nanny's wage. I'm asking why a man who can clearly afford anyone on earth is interviewing nannies himself at midnight, instead of leaving it to whoever normally does his hiring. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or its ghost. Because the last 5 people whoever normally does my hiring found for me lasted 9 days on average. A pause. Why Korea? The money. That's it? The money. That's it. The corner of his mouth did something complicated. First completely honest answer I've had in this room in longer than I can remember. I'm a dreadful liar. My grandmother says my whole face gives away my thoughts a full second before my mouth catches up to them. Then this house will wear you down to the frame within a month. It runs on things nobody here says out loud. He leaned back in his chair, studying her the way you'd study a structural problem. Do you know who I am, Miss Wambua? A rich man with a sick daughter and enough funeral flowers in his front hall to bury 3 separate people. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear wind moving against the glass, 3 floors up. For one long second she thought she'd overplayed it entirely, that she'd be back on the hill road inside the hour, suitcase and all. Then barely one corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. More the shape a smile leaves behind in a face that has forgotten how to finish one. Someone did die, he said quietly. My wife. 2 years ago this spring. A pause. Waited. And my daughter has been trying very patiently to follow her out the door ever since. What's wrong with her, exactly? Aplastic anemia. He said the term the way you say a word you've repeated so often it's worn smooth, like a coin handled too many times to still show its face. Her body has simply stopped manufacturing blood on its own. She needs a marrow transplant. There's no match. Not me, not anyone left in my family. Not the National Registry. Not the regional one. Not the 3 separate international databases my people have spent 2 years combing. His jaw set. I can purchase nearly anything that exists in this city. I have discovered, at considerable expense, that I cannot purchase her more time. And she stopped talking. It wasn't a question. Mwende had felt it the moment she'd stepped through the gate. A house holding its breath, and the shape of that held breath, unmistakably, a small girl somewhere above them. He looked at her, faintly startled she'd arrived at it so quickly. Not since the funeral. Traumatic mutism, the specialists call it. She hears everything, understands every word said to her, or about her. She simply made a decision, at 5 years old, that the world was no longer worth answering. Something raw moved across his face and vanished before she could properly name it. 5 years old, and she's already given up on the rest of us. Especially you, I'd guess. It left her mouth before she'd fully decided to let it. You're extraordinarily direct for a woman applying to mop floors and read bedtime stories. I'm extraordinarily right, too, more often than not. Ask anyone who's ever hired me. He almost laughed, one short exhale, more surprise than humor, and stood, crossing to the window to look down at the harbor lights coming on one grid at a time, like a man weighing, for perhaps the 1,000th time, whether the whole glittering kingdom below him had been worth what it had actually cost him to build. 5 nannies before you. None of them lasted a month. They came for the salary and left because of the fear. What frightened them? There are men who come to this house at night. Rooms you will never be asked to enter. Things you will eventually see and will be expected to have never seen. He turned to face her fully. If you repeat one syllable of what happens behind that gate, I will end you professionally, financially, and thoroughly. I would prefer not to need to make good on that. But I will. He said all of it in the exact register another man might use to discuss the likelihood of rain, which was, she understood only much later, the genuinely frightening part. Mwende thought of her grandmother's roof, the bank's letters, the silent child somewhere above them who'd apparently decided the entire world wasn't worth a single word. I have 3 conditions if you still want me. He laughed properly this time, one short, disbelieving breath. You are in absolutely no position to be issuing conditions, Miss Wambua. I'm aware. I'm issuing them anyway. Something in his face shifted. Not quite amusement. Something closer to interest. Go on, then. 1. Sundays belong to me entirely. I call my grandmother. I find whatever this city has instead of a church and I sit in it. I remember, once a week, that I'm a person and not a fixture bolted to your hallway. That one doesn't move for any amount of money. He said nothing, which she chose to read as agreement. 2. Whatever happens in this house after dark is your business, and I meant what I said. I won't ask, I won't flinch, I won't run. But her room isn't part of that business. No raised voices anywhere near it. No weapons within its walls. When that child is asleep, this entire house learns to whisper. You included Mr. Moon. His eyes narrowed slightly at that. He didn't say no. 3. She stood, matching him nearly eye to eye even in stocking feet on his cold marble. You will never once tell me to hold back with her. You have 6 full-time staff in this house, and every one of them is so frightened of loving a dying child that she hasn't had anyone's whole heart since her mother's funeral. I am not going to be careful with her the way the rest of you have decided to be. If you hire me, I love that girl at full volume, starting tomorrow morning. That one is also not negotiable. Jivan studied her for a long moment. In 20 years, evidently, nobody had spoken to him this way inside this room and then simply been allowed to walk back out of it on their own feet. 2,000,001 a week, he said finally. Cash, every Friday. You start at 6 tomorrow. He picked his pen back up, then paused. There is a 4th condition. This one is mine, not yours. Which is? He didn't look up from the page. Don't fall in love with me, Miss Wambua. I'm not being modest. The women who have cared about me personally have a documented habit of ending up in far worse places than unemployed. She paused at the door, one hand resting on the frame, and looked back at him with an easy, unhurried smile. You can relax completely, Mr. Moon. I like men who still remember how to smile without being reminded to. She let that land. You've got some work to do before you're my type. She left, and for the first time in 2 years, Moon Jivan sat alone behind his glass wall and felt, absurdly, the pull of his own mouth wanting to do exactly what she just described. The next morning Madame Yang led her up the staircase past a long gallery of photographs. The same beautiful woman laughing in every frame, always at something just outside the camera's reach, the dead wife, the reason for every lily in the house, and stopped at a door painted the palest possible pink, the single spot of real color anywhere Mwende had yet seen under that roof. "She won't look at you," Madame Yang warned, hand already on the handle. "She won't reach for you. Don't force either. And whatever else happens in that room." The sternness in her voice cracked, just slightly, and beneath it was something closer to pleading than Mwende had expected from a woman who'd introduced herself by forbidding affection. "Don't make her cry. Her body can no longer afford tears. They cost her something now that they didn't used to." The room inside was beautiful in the specific, aching way of a room built for a childhood that had never quite been permitted to happen in it. In a bed built for a much larger child sat the palest, thinnest girl Mwende had ever seen in person. Sua, 5 years old, skin drawn tissue thin over something fragile beneath it, a soft knit cap covering a head that chemotherapy had stripped bare. Her eyes were fixed on the window, huge and dark, as though half of her had already gone somewhere else entirely and the remaining half was simply waiting, with great patience, for permission to follow. She didn't turn when they entered. "Miss Sua," Madame Yang began. "It's all right," Mwende said softly. "You can go. We're only going to sit together a while." Madame Yang hesitated, visibly surprised at herself for hesitating at all, and then, to her own evident astonishment, actually left. Mwende didn't rush the bed. She didn't coo, didn't reach out, didn't slide into the falsely bright register that sick children can smell from 3 rooms away and instinctively distrust. She sat on the floor beneath the window instead, down at the child's own eye level, small and unthreatening, and looked out at the same gray harbor Sua was looking at and waited. A minute passed, then 2. "You've got a good window," she said at last, to the glass, not to the girl. "Back home in Machakos my grandmother kept a goat called Mbura, who despised every fence anyone ever built to hold her. One rainy season she got loose in a storm that took half the neighbor's roof clean off, and everyone said, well, that's the last we'll see of Mbura. 3 days later she strolled back into the compound on her own 4 legs, filthy, furious, entirely unbothered by the fact that the whole village had already mourned her, and went on to live another 6 years out of pure spite." Silence. "I have a feeling you might be a bit like Mbura." Nothing in the room moved, but Mwende caught it anyway because Mwende caught everything. The girl's eyes flicked, once, from the window to the strange new woman sitting cross-legged on her floor, then back to the window. It wasn't much. In a house where this child hadn't looked at another living soul in 2 years, it was very nearly everything. Mwende kept talking after that, unhurried, aimed at the glass and the gray water beyond it. Her grandmother's other goats, the particular smell of rain arriving on red dirt roads before the first drop actually fell. A neighbor's dog that lived in terror of chickens but had never once, in 11 years, so much as flinched at thunder. She asked nothing in return. She needed nothing in return. She simply poured warmth into that enormous silence the way you leave food out for something too wary to be coaxed any closer than it's ready to come on its own. When the nurse arrived with the evening medicine, Mwende didn't hold the child down the way the intake notes said every previous nanny had eventually had to. "I hear this stuff tastes like punishment," she said instead, eyeing the little plastic cup with theatrical suspicion. "Tell you what, you take it, and I'll tell you the single most disgusting thing I have ever eaten on a dare from my cousins. And I promise you it is genuinely disgusting. Deal?" Sua looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, silently, watching Mwende's face the entire time as though checking for the lie she fully expected to find, she opened her mouth and swallowed the medicine without a single fight. It was, the nurse told Madame Yang afterward in the corridor, the first time in longer than anyone on staff could actually remember. Madame Yang was waiting at the foot of the stairs when Mwende came down, an expression on her face that was difficult to place. She took her medicine without a struggle. The nurse says she simply opened her mouth. "We made a deal." Madame Yang looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had watched 5 capable adults fail this exact test and flee, and said something Mwende suspected she would deny to her own grave. "Come back tomorrow, Miss Wambua." A pause, stiff with the effort of saying it at all. "Please." The days found their shape within a week, the way water finds the lowest point in a room without needing to be told where it is. 6 in the morning, before the house had fully woken. The medicine schedule memorized inside 3 days. The whiteboard bolted to the wall of Sua's room with its small, brutal numbers. Platelet counts, hemoglobin, the merciless arithmetic of a body that could no longer sustain itself without outside help. Mwende learned that Sua despised being fussed over more than she seemed to despise the illness itself, that she loved the color yellow with a ferocity that outran any reasonable explanation, and that she slept every single night with a soft, one-eared stuffed elephant named Tembo pressed against her cheek, no exceptions permitted. Mwende never once pushed her to speak. She simply spoke enough for both of them, narrating the world the way a radio commentator narrates a match nobody in the room can actually see, reading picture books in a different ridiculous voice for every character, badly imitating her grandmother's goats and the minibus touts back home and her own mother's long-suffering sigh, until, twice on 2 separate afternoons, she caught the very corner of Sua's mouth twitch into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was unmistakably its earliest possible ancestor. She brought in a battered box of watercolors from a shop down near the harbor, the first toy to enter that pale pink room in longer than anyone on staff could remember, and painted beside the bed every single afternoon without once suggesting Sua join her. She simply painted, patient as weather, the way you leave a door unlocked rather than open. It was on the 11th day that a small, pale hand reached over without warning and dipped a brush straight into the yellow. Sua painted a sun. A lopsided, wobbling, entirely perfect sun, dead center of the page, rays flung out at every conceivable angle like something that had been waiting a very long time to be let out. Mwende had to excuse herself into the corridor to cry where the child wouldn't have to manage her feelings on top of everything else already being asked of her. Jivan started coming home early after that, though for the better part of a week, he told himself it was purely to review the whiteboard numbers in person. Instead, he found himself lingering in doorways, coat still on, watching a woman with almost nothing to her name build his daughter an entire small, warm universe out of a $2 box of paint and the sheer bloody-minded persistence of her voice. He watched Sua's eyes begin, for the first time in 2 years, to actually track another person around a room. Curious, alert, unmistakably alive, and he didn't have a ready word for what that did to the inside of his chest. It had been a long time since he'd needed one. Felt absurdly like hope. He was beginning to suspect hope simply felt like fear that had learned to wear a nicer coat. The discovery happened on the 9th night Mwende stayed past midnight. Sua had spiked a fever after dinner. Nothing catastrophic by the numbers, but enough that Mwende flatly refused to leave until it broke properly, sitting through 2 hours of a temperature that climbed before it finally, grudgingly, came back down. Close to 1 in the morning, restless and wanting something cold to drink, she took a wrong turn into the unlit east side of the house she'd never had cause to explore, and found a door standing open a careless inch, warm lamplight spilling through the gap, low voices underneath it, the specific flat, careful register that makes a body go still a full second before the mind has worked out exactly why. She should have turned around immediately. She looked instead. A long table. 6 men seated around it in dark, forgettable suits. Something wrapped tight in plastic sheeting stacked along one end like ordinary cargo waiting on a dock. And at the head of it, sleeves rolled to the forearm, jaw set like something carved rather than grown, Moon Jivan. Not the tired man who lingered in doorways watching his daughter paint, but something colder underneath that, harder, the structure the tired man had been built on top of. He said 4 quiet words in Korean, and every man at that table lost several distinct shades of color at once. This was the version of him Madame Yang had been warning her about since the gate. The glass trembled once in Wen's hand and Jivan, because a man who has survived as long as he has learns to feel a watcher the way you feel a sudden draft under a locked door, turned his head and looked straight through the gap in the doorway, straight at her. She didn't run. That was the detail that would matter later, the detail he would come back to more than once in the weeks that followed. Every nanny before her had run at the first sight of that room, out the gate, into the night, gone by morning. Mwende stood frozen for exactly as long as it took her heart to catch up with the rest of her body. And then she lifted her chin, gave one small, deliberate nod, and walked away. Not fleeing. Choosing to leave, which is an entirely different motion of the feet. He found her 20 minutes later in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't actually drinking. "You saw," he said from the doorway. "I saw, and I didn't run." "Where exactly would I run to?" Her voice barely shook. "Your daughter's running 102 fever upstairs, and there's no marrow match for her anywhere on this earth. You imagine I'm walking out on that child because her father keeps unpleasant company after dark?" Her eyes came up to meet his steady. "I already had a rough idea what you were the first day in your own office. You told me yourself. I'm not frightened of whatever happens in that wing of your house." He stepped fully into the kitchen light. "Then tell me, what does frighten you?" "That she's going to die anyway." And there it was, the one sentence nobody in that entire vast, silent house had ever once said aloud, cracked wide open now on the cold tile floor between them. "That I'll love her with absolutely everything I have. And it still won't be enough to keep her here. That's what frightens me, Mr. Moon. Not you. Never you." Moon Jivan feared the length of the southern coast, obeyed instantly and without question by men who killed professionally for a living. Pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and for the first time in 2 years, let another human being watch him be afraid. "Every second of every day," he said quietly. "The exact same fear." They talked until nearly 4 in the morning after that. Not about the men at the table or the plastic-wrapped cargo, but about Sua. About Yaren, his wife, who had died in a car meant to carry him, on a road meant for his own route home, because his second-in-command of nearly 2 decades, a man he would once, without hesitation, have called brother, had decided the whole operation belonged to him instead. About the 2 years since, spent converting grief into fortification, buying every specialist and every experimental protocol the world had on offer, none of it, able to purchase the one specific thing his daughter actually needed. A match. A stranger with the correct blood. One small, unglamorous miracle. "I would burn every part of it," he said, staring down at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else entirely. "The money, the port, all of it. For one match. For one more year of her calling me Appa." "She doesn't call you anything," Mwende said, as gently as the sentence allowed. "She doesn't talk." "I know." His voice cracked, once, and only once, like a hairline fracture appearing and then holding. "I would burn it all to the ground just to hear her voice again. A single word. Any word at all." Mwende reached across the table, past every condition she'd made him agree to on the very first day, and laid her palm flat over his cold one. "Mwende," she said. "Call me Mwende. Not Miss Wambua. Not tonight." He looked down at her hand resting over his like it was the single strangest object in a city he technically owned most of. "Mwende." A pause, careful, like a man testing whether a bridge would hold his weight. "If that just cracked something open in your chest, you are exactly my kind of person." It happened on the 7th day of the 3rd week. There had been a bad morning. A nosebleed that refused to stop for nearly 20 minutes, nurses hovering in the doorway, the entire house holding its breath the particular way houses do when something genuinely, quietly critical is happening behind a closed door. By afternoon it had passed, the numbers steadying, and Mwende sat at the edge of the enormous bed doing the only thing she knew how to do to bring color back into a room. Telling a story. "You remember Mbura," she said, one hand resting lightly against Sua's back. "The goat who got loose in the storm," and everyone said, "Well, that's the last we'll ever see of her?" Sua watched her. She always watched her now. Her small hand had learned, sometime in the last 3 weeks, to rest inside Mwende's like it had lived there its whole life. "She came back 3 days later," Mwende murmured. "Thin, filthy, absolutely furious about something nobody ever worked out. Completely unwilling to be finished yet, no matter what the whole village had already decided about her." She smoothed the soft cap over Sua's head, tucked the small body in against her side. "My grandmother always said some creatures simply decide, quietly, on their own terms, that it isn't their time to stop. And there's no fence built and no storm strong enough to argue them out of that decision once they've made it. I think you might be exactly that kind of creature." Sua, 5 years old, silent for 2 entire years, the girl 3 continents worth of specialists had gently, privately stopped expecting to speak again. looked up at the poor woman from Kenya who had filled her gray, careful world with a color she'd nearly forgotten she loved. Her chapped lips parted. Something rusty and cracked and barely audible came out of her. A door that had been sealed shut for 2 years, giving half an inch. "Amma." Mwende went completely still. "Baby, what did you just—" "Amma." Louder this time, certain of itself. Her small fingers tightened hard around Mwende's hand, and 2 years of stored, unspent silence broke open all at once. "Amma, don't go. Everybody goes. Please don't go. Amma." Mwende Wambua, who did not cry easily and rarely at all in front of anyone, pulled that fierce, fragile, fighting child fully into her arms and sobbed into the top of her soft cap. "Nowhere, baby. Do you hear me? Never. You are my Mbura, my impossible, unstoppable girl. I am not going anywhere, not ever, not for anything." Neither of them heard the door. Neither of them saw Moonjivan frozen in the frame, coat still on, his bag sliding off his shoulder and hitting the floor without either of them registering the sound, because his silent daughter, the one he had spent 2 years quietly bracing himself to lose without ever hearing her voice again, was talking. And the very first word she had chosen, after 2 years of a grief heavy enough to steal an entire child's voice out of her body, was mother. He sank slowly to his knees in the doorway, this feared and formidable man, and pressed one hand flat over his own mouth so that his daughter, in the middle of the first joy she'd allowed herself in 2 years, would not have to hear a monster weep. After that, nothing in the house was quite the same, and nothing about it felt quite as safe either, because joy, it turned out, is its own kind of exposure. Sua talked constantly now, not yet to everyone, but endlessly to Mwende, 2 years of banked-up words tumbling out of her in no particular order at all hours. She called her Amma in front of the nurses, in front of Madame Yong, in front of her own father, and nobody in that entire enormous house had the heart or the nerve to correct her. Even her numbers began, slowly, to climb. The doctors stayed cautious. Joy is not medicine. One of them warned, not unkindly, but admitted, off the record and only once, that they had never in their careers seen a child fight this hard simply to remain in a room. Jivan fell from Mwende the way empires generally fall. Slowly, and then all at once, and then in ways he could no longer pretend not to notice. He stopped inventing reasons for coming home early. He brought her deliberately terrible convenience store coffee because she'd once mentioned, laughing, that she missed bad gas station coffee more than she'd ever expected to miss anything. He learned the voices from Sua's picture books, badly, and let his own daughter correct his pronunciation without complaint or embarrassment. He sat on the floor of that pale pink room in a suit that cost more than most cars and let a 5-year-old paint a wobbling yellow sun across the back of his hand, and then wore it, unwashed, into a meeting with 3 of the most dangerous men on the southern coast, daring any one of them to comment. One night, after Sua had finally gone down for good, he found Mwende out on the terrace, watching the harbor lights blink on across the water. "You've broken every condition you set for yourself that first night," he said. "Most of them," she agreed, without turning around. "Which one are you thinking of specifically?" "The 4th rule. Mine, not yours." Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly. "I genuinely don't know what you mean." "Then stop looking at my face the way you're currently looking at it." He came to stand beside her at the rail. In the low light off the water he didn't resemble anyone's monster at all. Just a tired man slowly remembering that he was still, technically, allowed to want things for himself. "You have a catastrophic face for lying, by your own account. Then don't look at it." "I can't. That's become the entire problem. I haven't been able to stop for weeks now." "You warned me the first night," she said quietly, "about exactly this. I know precisely what I said." His hand came up, slow, and brushed a stray curl back from her face as though she might come apart under too much pressure. Strange, given that he was meant to be the dangerous one standing on that terrace. "I'm asking you to ignore the warning anyway, and I'm frightened, because I already cannot afford to lose you, and that fact alone is a weapon, and I have just handed it to the entire world by saying it out loud." "Then don't fall for me either," she said. "Those were your rules." She leaned in anyway. "I'm a broke nanny with 1 suitcase and a grandmother who needs a new roof before the long rains start. she murmured against the small distance still left between them. I'm not remotely what men like you are supposed to marry. You're everything men like me spend our entire lives pretending we don't need. His forehead nearly touched hers. Marry into every bit of this trouble, Mwende Wambua. Be her mother out loud, permanently, in front of everyone. Be mine. There's usually dinner involved before a man says something like that to a woman. I own 4 restaurants in this city. Choose one. Choose all 4. I'll close them to the public for the evening. That's not quite the same thing as being asked properly. I have never once in my life asked anyone for anything properly, he said. You'll have to allow me the practice. She laughed despite every intention not to, and then she wasn't laughing at all anymore, and neither was he, and the small remaining distance between them simply ceased to exist. Ugh! Gross. They broke apart fast. Sua stood in the doorway in her pajamas. One arm looped tight around Tembo, wearing an expression of purely theatrical disgust that took up her entire small face. Sua, Jivan managed, half laughing, half strangled with embarrassment. You were meant to be asleep 2 hours ago. Madame Yang said if I stayed very quiet I'd catch you two being embarrassing. Sua marched fully into the room, entirely unbothered by the hour or by having been caught doing exactly what she'd been sent to do. She was right. I'm gonna go tell her she was right. Please don't, Jivan said with real feeling. I'm absolutely telling her. Sua wedged herself onto the bench between them without being invited, the way she'd taken to doing everywhere lately, claiming one of Mwende's hands and then, after a moment's serious consideration, one of Jivan's as well. She looked up at Mwende with sudden, total gravity. Is he going to be my Appa now? Really and actually. Not just visiting Appa. Mwende crouched down to meet her properly, eye to eye. Would you like that? Sua weighed the question the way she weighed everything, as though the fate of something enormous depended on getting the answer exactly right. I would like it if you both stayed. Forever stayed. Not visiting stayed. Then that's precisely what we'll do, Mwende said. Forever stayed. I promise you that one specifically. Sua nodded once, satisfied, the way a judge nods after handing down a verdict she'd already privately reached days earlier, and settled in against Mwende's side as though the matter were now formally closed and she intended to enjoy the rest of the evening in peace. And watching the two of them together on that terrace, Moon Jivan made a private promise of his own. One that had nothing whatsoever to do with weddings, and everything to do with a man named Go Sukmin, who had already begun, quietly and carefully, to notice that the throne he had spent 2 years waiting to inherit was slipping a little further out of his reach with every week that girl spent learning to talk again. Go Sukmin moved the way certain snakes do, from beneath, while every eye in the room is fixed somewhere else entirely. Jivan had already begun quietly dismantling pieces of his own operation by then, pulling money clear, closing accounts one careful thread at a time, so that when Sua finally got her match, when he had started making himself say never if, he could walk into an ordinary life with an ordinary daughter and an extraordinary wife, and leave nothing behind him for anyone to come looking for. But a man doesn't simply walk away from an operation like that one. He has to be released from it. And Go Sukmin had spent 2 years, and one dead wife, making absolutely certain that release never came. The blow arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, wrapped in the cruelest possible packaging. An unknown number, calling Mwende's own phone directly. Miss Wambua. The voice was unhurried, almost courteous. His English the polished, careful kind that gets learned for boardrooms rather than friendships. You won't know my name. I've made rather a point of learning yours, though, along with a good deal else about you. The woman who got the little princess talking again. It's a lovely story. It's traveled further than you'd probably guess. Ice moved the length of her spine. Who is this? Call me an old associate of the household. Considerably older than Jivan would ever willingly admit to. He let that sit a moment, clearly enjoying the shape of the silence. I'm going to tell you something he never will, because unlike him, I don't believe people deserve to be kept in the dark about the facts actually deciding their own lives. The Marrow Registry. Has that particular word come up between the two of you yet? What about it? 14 months ago, the system produced a match. Real. Cleared. Ready to proceed on 48 hours' notice. He said each word slowly, savoring it like something expensive held on the tongue. That match was scrubbed clean from every database that held a record of it, and the donor was informed, in writing, that the child in question had already passed away. I do wonder, Miss Wambua, who in this entire city might possess the particular reach required to make an international system forget a dying girl ever existed in the first place. She couldn't manage a full breath. You're inventing this. Am I? Ask yourself honestly who profits from Moon Jivan grieving, distracted, reduced to half the man he used to be. A father consumed entirely by loss makes for a remarkably careless king. A soft, satisfied exhale on the line. I never touched the child, understand. I only misplaced her one real chance, to keep her father exactly where he was useful to me. Weak. And now, it seems, he's grown himself a brand new weakness. You. What do you want? Bring the girl to me tomorrow. Alone. And I will hand you the actual match myself, the real name, the real hospital, all of it verified. Save her life? Or protect her father's pride, and let her die precisely on schedule as originally planned. Entirely your choice, and I do genuinely mean that. The line went dead. Mwende stood in the middle of the pale pink room, phone shaking in her hand, and looked at Sua asleep against her pillows, Tembo tucked beneath her chin, and felt the entire floor of her understanding tilt sideways all at once. Because the true horror of it wasn't only the ultimatum itself. The true horror was this. Jivan would never have told her any of it. He would have carried a stolen miracle alone, the way he carried absolutely everything, and let it quietly hollow him out from the inside before he handed his enemies one more inch of what remained of his heart to work with. She found him in his study. Did you know, she said, quiet and terrible, that there was a match 14 months ago? He went the color of ash and stood so fast his chair toppled over behind him. How could you possibly? So it's true. It's actually true. There was a match. Someone erased it. And you already knew. Her voice cracked wide open down the middle. You would have let me love that child every single day for the rest of both our lives without ever once telling me that someone out there might have saved her. Because you couldn't find them yourself, and you decided that not telling me was somehow kinder than telling me the truth. 14 months. The ice in him shattered all at once. The first time she had ever watched him lose control of himself completely, in front of anyone. Half my fortune spent chasing a ghost Sukmin buried deep enough that it might as well never have existed at all. I didn't tell you because it would have handed you hope, and hope is the one single thing on this earth I cannot protect either of us from. Do you have any idea what it does to a person holding a door open that refuses, year after year, to give? I was carrying it so that you wouldn't have to. That was never your job to carry by yourself. She was shouting now, openly, tears coming freely down her face. That's the entire meaning of family, Jivan. You carry the weight together, especially the parts that hurt the worst. She steadied herself with visible effort, and then delivered the sentence that changed everything in that room. He called me an hour ago. Sukmin. Jivan went very, very still. He has the real match, she whispered. He'll trade it to me if I bring Sua to him tomorrow. Alone. Those are his exact terms. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room after a grenade's pin has already left the hand holding it. He will kill you both, Jivan said, deadly quiet. The instant you're out of my sight, that match becomes nothing but bait on a hook. Nobody walks into Sukmin's hands and walks back out of them afterward. Nobody in 20 years. I know that, which is exactly why we don't play it his way. She wiped her face with the back of one hand, and when she looked up again, her eyes were her grandmother's eyes precisely. Every hard, unbreakable woman in her entire family line who had ever flatly refused to fold under pressure. You built an empire specifically so that nothing could ever touch either of you again. Fine. It's time to actually spend it instead of protecting it. Every favor owed to you, every shilling and every one. Every dangerous man who has ever bowed his head to you in a hallway out of fear. Spend it on what exactly? On finding that donor before he can sell them to us as leverage. She crossed to the desk, the broke woman from Machikos, a general now in every way that mattered, a fleck of dried yellow paint still faintly visible beneath one fingernail. The match is his only genuine card in this entire game. So we take it directly out of his hand before he can play it. You control most of the underground trade moving through this coastline. He has one stolen file and nothing else. Somewhere out there in the world is a real, living, breathing person who once said yes, I will help save a child I will never personally meet. Find them first, and Sukmin has nothing left at all to trade with. He becomes, in that instant, simply a man holding a gun and no leverage whatsoever. He looked at the woman his silent daughter had chosen, out of every single person inside that enormous house, to call her mother. For the first time in 14 months, the exhaustion drained visibly out of his eyes, and something with actual teeth in it moved into the space that exhaustion left behind. Get Madame Yang, he said, already reaching for his phone. Move SUA to the reinforced floor tonight. Nobody in or out of this house without my direct authorization. His voice dropped into the register Mwende had heard exactly once before, through a gap in a door on the 9th night, the register that had made 6 grown, armed men lose their color at once. I'm going to start making calls, and I don't expect to stop for some time. What followed was 72 hours Mwende would spend the rest of her life failing to properly describe to her own grandmother. Jivan spent his empire the way a man sets fire to his own house on purpose, to save everyone still standing inside it. 20 years of favors called in all at once, in a single night. Doctors woken at 3 in the morning without apology. A retired international registry administrator in Geneva, who owed him a debt considerably older than Mwende's entire time in the country. Money moving through the city like water, finding every available crack simultaneously. The whole enormous patient machine he had spent a decade building to hurt people, aimed, for the first time in its existence, entirely at saving one. And Mwende did the one thing that belonged only to her to do, because the stolen file had left behind a single detail even Sukmin's people hadn't thought to erase. A fragment of the original swab's registration location, buried deep inside metadata nobody had bothered to check. The donor had registered at a community health drive, 14 months earlier, at a church compound just outside Machakos. Mwende read the location and felt her eyes go hot immediately, because she knew that exact scene without needing another detail explained to her. She had grown up walking past gatherings just like it every single dry season. A borrowed tent, plastic chairs in crooked rows, a health worker with a clipboard and a cooler box of swab kits, someone's auntie pouring tea for whoever stood waiting in line. Just a cheek swab, data. You never really know whose whole life you might be carrying home with you afterward. I can find her, she said. Not with your hackers. With my grandmother. She called home. Grandma Nduku, 78 years old, ran the Women's Fellowship and half the prayer chain between Machakos town and the edge of the escarpment, and personally knew every pastor, every deacon, and every mobile clinic nurse for 100 kilometers in each direction. She put on her reading glasses without being asked twice and began making calls of her own, one after another, methodical as a woman closing up a shop for the night. Because it turned out that no criminal network on either continent could move information faster than one determined Kenyan grandmother with a landline, a prayer list, and a firm private conviction that God expected her to finish precisely what she'd started. They found her in just under 30 hours. Faith Mutinda, a community health nurse working out of a small clinic near Kangandu, who had swabbed her own cheek at that same drive on an ordinary Sunday afternoon and mostly forgotten about it entirely, until a form letter nearly a year later informed her that the child she'd matched with had already died. She had quietly, privately grieved a stranger's baby she had never once met, for the better part of a year, and told almost no one. Mwende called her directly, the way you'd call a neighbor rather than a stranger, because in every way that mattered they no longer were strangers. Faith, my name is Mwende Wambua. The little girl you matched with 14 months ago. She isn't dead. She's 5 years old. Her name is Sua. She just learned how to speak again. And the very first word she chose was Umma. A long silence opened up on the line from Kenya. Then Faith said, through what were unmistakably her own tears now, the same simple phrase that had, in its way, started this entire chain of events months earlier without her ever knowing it. Then let's go save that child properly. Go Sukmin still held his meeting at the appointed hour the following evening. He simply had no idea yet that the ground beneath the entire arrangement had already shifted well out from under him. He had expected Mwende, frightened, Alone, cornered, the child clutched hard against her chest, exactly as instructed. Instead, in a cold warehouse down near the old fish market, his own men lining the walls on either side, the door opened and Moon Jivan walked in entirely by himself, empty-handed, smiling in a way that made every single man in that room take an involuntary step backward before they'd even decided to move. "You look surprised, Hyung," Jivan said in Korean, soft as falling snow. "You were expecting someone considerably easier to frighten. Where is the girl?" Sukmin's usual, practiced patience had worn dangerously thin. On a flight with a fully screened donor seated directly beside her, headed toward a surgery that neither one of us has any power left to stop now. Jivan watched the color leave the older man's face by careful degrees and didn't smile any wider, because he'd learned over the last 72 hours that real monsters don't require an audience to enjoy a moment like this one. They only require being right. Faith Mutinda, a clinic just outside Kangandu, Kenya. You scrubbed 3 separate international registries perfectly clean, Sukmin, and never once thought to check whether the original swab itself had left any trail of its own behind. Sukmin took one step forward. Every weapon in that warehouse rose to meet the movement instantly. Jivan didn't grant a single one of them so much as a passing glance. "You held exactly one piece of real leverage over me," he said. "I removed it from the board entirely while you were still quietly congratulating yourself for having found it in the first place. My daughter goes into surgery within hours. Whatever you believed you still held over me is finished as of tonight. Which leaves us only the older business still standing between us." "The older business," Sukmin echoed, and something in his voice finally, audibly cracked open. "Yaren." The temperature in that warehouse seemed to drop 10 full degrees in a single breath. "My wife. A car meant to end me instead ended her on a road I was meant to be driving that night, and you have spent 2 full years enjoying the way that particular mathematics worked out in your favor, keeping my daughter's life as collateral so that I would stay too broken to ever notice you'd never actually stepped back the way you claimed to have. So I stopped mourning 3 days ago, on the Tuesday you made the mistake of calling my nanny directly. I started, instead, on everything else that was still owed. What Sukmin had no way of knowing, what he would never get the chance to properly understand, was that those same 72 hours of frantic calls hadn't only located Faith Mutinda on the other side of the planet. They had also, quietly and patiently, turned half the men currently lining that warehouse's walls, using the 2 things Sukmin had never once thought to offer any of them in 20 years of command: mercy and a genuine, verifiable way out. Half the guns in that room already belonged, in every way that mattered, to Jivan. The other half worked it out roughly 4 seconds too late for the realization to change anything at all. It's cleaner, for everyone's sake, to leave the remainder of that warehouse exactly where it happened, in the dark, unwitnessed. Say only this much. The man who controlled Mokpo's harbor trade collected a 2-year-old debt in full that night, in every sense the word allows, and Go Sukmin never threatened a child again for as long as he lived, which turned out not to be very much longer at all. Comment below if you think he got precisely what 2 years of patient cruelty had finally earned him. When it was finished, Jivan stood alone in the sudden quiet of that warehouse, and for the first time since a car had exploded on a wet coastal road 2 years earlier, felt the entire weight of it actually lift clear off his chest, all at once, like a held breath finally released. He took out his phone and called the only person left in the world he wanted to hear. "It's done," he said. "All of it finished. All of it." Mwende asked, from a hospital corridor on the opposite side of the planet, where a community health nurse from a farming town outside Kangandu and a full surgical team were already preparing to give a small girl an entirely new blood supply. "The operation, Sukmin. The whole gate I built specifically to keep the rest of the world out." His voice caught just once audibly. "There's genuinely nothing left keeping me tied to any of it anymore except—" He stopped himself mid-sentence. "Except a nanny and her daughter. If they'll still have a broken man with dried yellow paint permanently stuck under his fingernails and considerably less money than he used to carry." Mwende looked through the glass at Sua. Awake now, frightened, undeniably brave, Tembo clutched hard against her chest, waving at her with a grin bright enough, Mwende privately thought, to power the entire hospital wing on its own. "Get on a plane, Jivan," she said. laughing and crying in the exact same breath. Your daughter is about to get her miracle. Don't you dare be the one who misses it. The transplant did not take instantly. Nothing genuinely worth having ever does. There were hard weeks that followed. Isolation rooms, masked kisses pressed through plastic sheeting, blood counts that climbed and dipped and climbed again before finally, stubbornly holding steady. Faith stayed the entire time and became, in every practical sense, something very close to family. Grandma Nduku boarded an airplane for the first time in her 78 years to do it, wept without a shred of self-consciousness through the arrivals hall at Mwende International, and held on to the man she had taken to calling her reformed criminal in every phone call since, gripping him so fiercely that his own security detail pretended, out of genuine respect, not to notice their employer blinking hard in a public terminal. And slowly, the way stubborn things generally do, Sua came all the way back to herself. Color returned to her face first, then hair, growing back in dark and soft beneath a bright yellow beanie Mwende had knitted deliberately crooked on purpose, so Sua would have something new to laugh about each morning. Strong enough to sit up unassisted, then to stand. Then, one entirely ordinary spring morning that nobody had marked on any calendar as significant, to run the full length of a hospital corridor on her own two legs, straight into Mwende's waiting arms, shouting, Amma, look at me go. Mwende caught her, lifted her clean off the floor, and swung her once through the light falling sideways across the corridor windows. They married in the garden that used to hold nothing but funeral lilies. Mwende had every last one of them dug out by the roots and replaced with flame lilies instead. Sua's own choice, the very moment she saw a photograph of one, bright red-orange and unapologetically loud, planted now in careful rows everywhere the white flowers used to stand in silent mourning. Grandma Nduku's speech ran twice as long as anyone present had budgeted for and reduced Madame Yang to tears she flatly denied shedding for the remainder of her life. Faith stood up as a bridesmaid, 3 continents and one impossible coincidence away from the health fair where all of it had actually begun. And Moon Jivan, who had once warned a complete stranger from Machikos that caring about him personally tended to end very badly for the person doing the caring, stood beneath an arch strung entirely with flame lilies and spent his own vows quietly, thoroughly, joyfully proving himself wrong in front of every witness he had left in the world. Sua was the flower girl. She took the responsibility with tremendous, unshakable seriousness. When the officiant asked who was giving this woman to be married, Sua shouted, "Me!" before a single other person in that garden had a chance to speak, and the whole ceremony dissolved, instantly and completely, into laughter. Mwende knelt down in her wedding dress afterward and pulled her daughter in close. "Do you know what you are?" she whispered into hair that had grown back in exactly where no specialist on 3 continents had ever quite believed it would. "Like Mbura," Sua said back, getting every single word right on the first try. "The one who came home anyway, when everyone had already decided she wasn't coming." "That's exactly right, baby." A kiss pressed to her forehead. "You came home anyway." Somewhere upstairs, in a house that used to hold its breath and now rarely stopped making noise of some kind, a single crooked watercolor sun still hung framed above a desk, exactly where a father who had once forgotten the shape of his own smile had insisted, the very week it was painted, that it be hung and never taken down. She had crossed an ocean for a salary that would keep her grandmother's roof from caving in. She had stayed for a little girl who point-blank refused to stop fighting for her own life. What she left with, in the end, was a daughter who ran instead of drifted, a husband who had rebuilt himself, slowly and on purpose, into someone considerably gentler than the entire city had ever once expected to meet, and a house on a hill above Mokpo that finally sounded, every single ordinary day, like somewhere real people actually lived. So here's my honest question for you, and I want the truth. If a man everyone in the city warned you about sat you down on your very first night and told you plainly, "Don't fall in love with me," would you have taken his advice and walked straight back out that gate? Or would you have stayed anyway, exactly like she did? Tell me the truth in the comments. I read every single one.